A woman sits handcuffed on a courtroom bench in downtown Los Angeles. Sheriff's deputies stand on either side of her. She hasn't stolen anything. She hasn't lied to anyone. She is, in fact, the victim in this case, the one witness the prosecution needs to put to burglars behind bars, and she is going to jail anyway. Not for what she said on the stand, for what she was wearing when she said it. This is November 1938, and the woman in handcuffs is about to become the most talked about kindergarten teacher in America for exactly 5 days. Then the world will forget her name for the next 50 years, while she quietly does something far more important than anything that happens in this courtroom. Her name is Helen Hulick, and her story starts with a pair of pants. Helen was 29 years old, unmarried, and teaching kindergarten in Los Angeles when burglars broke into her apartment building. She was called to testify, the key witness, the person whose account could put both men away. She showed up to court dressed the way she dressed most days, in slacks, not flashy, not a statement piece. Just comfortable trousers she'd been wearing since she was a teenager. Judge Arthur S. Guerin didn't see it that way. Before the case could even get underway, he stopped everything to address her outfit. Women in his courtroom wore dresses. He ordered her to come back properly attired. Helen walked out of that courtroom and, within earshot of every reporter waiting outside, told them exactly where. She stood. She wasn't changing. "They're comfortable," she said of the slacks, and that was that. 5 days later, she walked back into the same courtroom in the same kind of outfit. The judge gave her one more chance: put on a dress or face contempt of court. She didn't move. What happened next made front pages from coast to coast. Judge Guerin held her in contempt on the spot. She was handcuffed in open court, the star witness in a burglary case, arrested not for anything she'd done, but for the fabric on her legs. She was booked into the Los Angeles County Jail and issued a standard denim smock, the same one worn by every other woman held there. A wire photographer caught her being led away. By the next morning, that photograph was running in newspapers in Chicago, in Atlanta, in New York. The headline practically wrote itself: "A woman thrown in jail for wearing pants." The reaction wasn't quiet. Editorial pages weighed in. Readers wrote letters. And within days, the case landed in front of the California 2nd District Court of Appeal, which didn't hesitate. The judges ruled unanimously that what a witness wears has nothing to do with the administration of justice. Judge Guerin's contempt order was thrown out. Helen Hulick walked free. And here's where the story does something you don't expect. When she finally returned to finish her testimony, months later, in January 1939, she walked in wearing a full-length evening gown. Not because anyone made her, because by then, the fight wasn't about the dress at all. It had never really been about the dress. And she'd already won it. She testified, the burglars were convicted, the case was closed. But something bigger had already started moving. Within a few years, World War II would pull millions of American women out of their homes and onto factory floors, welding, riveting, assembling aircraft, running machines that had never been run by women before. And when they showed up for that work, they needed exactly what Helen Hulick had been arrested for wearing. By 1943, pants weren't a scandal on a factory floor. They were the uniform. That's the part of Helen Hulick's story most people know, if they know her name at all. A 5-day jail sentence, a photograph, a punchline about how far we've come. It's not even close to the most important thing she did. At some point in the 1940s, Helen left Los Angeles. She married a man named Richard Beebe and became Helen Hulick Beebe. She settled with him in a small industrial town in eastern Pennsylvania called Easton, 60 miles north of Philadelphia. And there she started a different kind of fight, one that would last the rest of her life and touch far more people than one courtroom ever could. Helen had trained as a speech and hearing therapist at a time when the accepted wisdom about profoundly deaf children was simple: teach them sign language and don't expect them to speak. Helen didn't accept that. She believed that even children with very little usable hearing could, with the right combination of amplification and intensive, patient, one-on-one therapy, learn to hear enough of their own voice to speak, to say their own names, to answer a teacher, to talk to their own parents. In 1944, she opened the Helen Beebe Speech and Hearing Center in Easton. She ran it herself for the next 40 years. Over those 4 decades, she trained generation after generation of therapists in what would come to be known as the auditory verbal approach, a method that still shapes how deaf children are taught to listen and speak today. She worked one child at a time with families who'd been told their sons and daughters would never talk. And she helped many of them do exactly that. In 1985, Lafayette College, right there in Easton, gave her an honorary doctorate for that work. 4 years later, in October 1989, she died at 80 years old. Read the obituaries that ran in the Los Angeles papers that week, and you'll notice something. Most of them lead with the pants, the 1938 arrest. The photograph, the 5 days in jail. Almost none of them lead with the 40 years that came after the center in Easton, the children who learned to speak, the therapists she trained who are still practicing her methods today. But if you look closely, those 2 stories aren't really separate at all. In that courtroom in 1938, a judge tried to decide what a grown woman was allowed to wear on her own body. She refused to let him. For the next 50 years, in a small clinic in Pennsylvania, an entire field of medicine had already decided what profoundly deaf children were allowed to become. Helen Beebe spent her life refusing to accept that too. Same woman. Same fight, really just fought on a much quieter stage for a lot longer, for people who couldn't fight it themselves. She never asked to be remembered for the slacks. But maybe the reason that story still gets told, nearly 90 years later, is that it's the same instinct that built everything that came after it. The refusal to let someone else decide who you're allowed to be.